Thank you very much. Thank you for these insightful words. It is indeed a pleasure to be here today. It's an honor to be allowed to be here in the opening of the Jean Monnet chair. So first of all, let me congratulate you, Nuno Rodrigues, for this chair. This is the only one granted in Portugal this year. And I'm absolutely certain that you will make a very important contribution to the EU studies and, of course, close to heart for me, to the understanding of European competition law. I sometimes wonder if it's needed, because here in Portugal you have such an amazing competition culture. We see it in the marketplace with the economic results over the last couple of years. We see it on the football playing field. For me, most important in the Eurovision Song Contest. That was beautiful. This, of course, is about the language and inspiration and where we take it from. And the chair that we are celebrating and honoring today takes the name from Jean Monnet. It is largely thanks to him that we can be here today and talk about European competition law, because he helped a key role in the creation of European competition law. Monnet, he came from a business family. They were very active in the wine sector. The company still exists today and has been producing cognac for more than a century. Before Jean Monnet started his political career, he succeeded his father as the head of the family business. And perhaps this personal background and insight in how the market is working for a business person, well, maybe that was what made him so aware of the importance of allowing companies to compete on the merits. He spent some time in the US because of this family firm. And what he saw made him consider the US Sherman Act to be one of the important building blocks of the US economic success. And this insight, this on-site specific experience of what it means to have strong competition laws, well, that influenced Monnet to model European antitrust rules on US legislation. He saw clearly that integration of markets would only succeed if competition was not disturbed by companies or by governments. And he was convinced that consumers would not be able to enjoy the benefits of a European community unless discriminatory and anti-competitive arrangements were banned. He saw very clearly that we need the rules in order to achieve what we want, that the market serves the citizen in the role as the consumer and not the other way round. So for 60 years, European competition rules has been here to assume that the economy works fairly for everyone. Our rules enable businesses of all sizes and all nationalities to have a fair chance to compete and to provide the basis for European consumers to demand a fair deal. Obviously, markets have changed over these 60 years. In particular, over the last 10 years, the digitalization of the economy has radically transformed the way we consume and the way that markets operate. The digital era has also brought completely new players to the fore, some of which have grown rapidly and have risen to become tech giants. I think it's important not to necessarily worry too much when a company is big and successful and when they come into our marketplace. The ambition of being successful is one of the things that brings choice, innovative products, lower prices into the market. So it is important to welcome those companies, but of course with one thing in mind. They should never try to undermine competition from others. And our task as competition enforcers, I'm so happy to work closely with my Portuguese colleagues in doing that, is to strike exactly the right balance between, on the one hand, to give businesses room to grow, to succeed, and on the other hand, to step in if they act in ways that will harm competition. If we intervene when we shouldn't, for example, by blocking a merger that would have helped companies to cut prices with no serious harm to competition, well, then consumers will not benefit from lower prices. And even in times where we talk a lot about innovation, it is important to respect that for many consumers, lower prices is a very important thing. Because if you're on a small budget, well, then lower prices is of great value to you. On the other hand side, if another merger seriously reduces competition, well, then consumers stand to lose out. Because then they may suffer from higher prices and lower quality if the market is no longer competitive. Therefore, of course, we aim to strike the right balance in our law enforcement so as to protect consumers and at the same time to create a healthy environment for businesses to grow. As market evolves, well, we need to be willing and ready to assess whether our rules are still fit for purpose. Because competition law should also evolve as market does. One of the beauties of our long-standing European antitrust rules is that they lay down very stable principles and leave it to competition authorities and to courts to apply them in practice. And that is a very important interrelationship between the enforcing authorities and our courts. Because in this ways, well, the rules have been open enough to deal with new technologies and markets and at the same time being stable. I think the Google Android case is a very good example of that. The market for smartphones and tablets, well, it is hardly a decade old. However, the conduct we saw in the Google Android case is not new. Because it's not new that a powerful company tried to tie products together. If they know that everyone wants the best-selling product, they may try to force consumers to buy other products as well. One of the groundbreaking cases in this field involved a company called Hilti, insisting that consumers had to buy nails for their nail guns from Hilti rather than from alternative suppliers. The Commission then concluded that Hilti had abused a dominant position on the nail gun market. This is a very specific case. You may have the nail gun in front of you, you may have the horror of trying to, or risking, to have your own fingers between what you want to nail. This is very specific. It seems as the old world. And yet, the rules that we applied in that case are the same set of rules that we are applying in the Google Android case. Because here we find that Google's behavior was similar. Phone manufacturers who wanted Google's popular Play Store, where you buy apps, and which is considered a must-have product, well, they had to agree to pre-install also Google Search and Google Chrome. And the thing is, you know, the Play Store is not something that you can download afterwards, that you can yourself install. The App Store has to come with the phone. And that, of course, made sure that when you have the out-of-the-box experience, it's a Google experience, the search and the browser. What they did was not only to tie the two together, to say if you want the Play Store, you will have to take also search and also the browser. They also said, and we will pay you. We will share part of our profits with you for this to be profitable. And at the same time, we will make sure that if you ever consider doing something else, we will not work with you anymore on any of your phones. So you both had a very strong economic incentive to stay and a very, very big risk if you consider doing something else. Part of this, of course, is the question of exclusivity. You can only do this if you want to do just a single thing. And as said, here in this case, Google paid manufacturers for not pre-installing other search apps alongside its own. These restrictions, as well as the third one I mentioned, well, they restrict the use of alternative versions of the Android operating system. They are holding back on innovation in some of the most advanced markets in the world. And holding back on innovation, well, that is, of course, a very serious offense. Because the whole point in Android being open source is, of course, for everyone who has the skills, which is not me, to be able to improve that software since it is exactly open source. But the Google behavior effectively minimized and locked down Android for this innovation not to happen. These are results of technological advances. And as a result of that, of course, we are also faced with new kinds of cartels, not just this kind of misuse of a dominant position as the one by Google. The Commission have been dealing with cartels for 60 years. And very often these cases, they involve companies who fix prices or who decide to share the market between them. Recently, we opened a cartel investigation into a very different kind of conduct. We're looking at our contacts between a number of German car companies. Not because we are concerned that they coordinated prices or that they decided to share the market between them. What we are trying to establish is whether they agreed not to introduce new technologies to clean car emissions. That, of course, is very scary if we are right, that companies decide not to use the best technology to clean emissions. We only opened the formal proceedings in September, and of course, we don't know yet if the companies broke the law or not. But a cartel that holds back innovation would be as illegal as one that is fixing prices. Again, our rules, well, they seem to be fit to deal with new ways of collusion. Technology keeps evolving at incredible speed. In particular, when it comes to the digital economy, there are bound to be new developments that we cannot imagine for the moment. Therefore, we have to make sure that our rules stays relevant for the future. For example, the use of data and algorithms. Well, they may allow companies to find new ways to distort competition in their favor. And this is why earlier this year, I asked 3 special advisors to look at how the increasingly digital economy will affect consumers, and to reflect on what should then be the response of competition policy. They will prepare a report by the end of March next year, and as part of the same forward-looking exercise, in January we will hold a conference in Brussels to discuss this issue. And we have received numerous contributions from stakeholders from this event in order to get a full discussion and a much better picture about what we have ahead of us. And I'm looking very much forward to gather the views of experts who will feed into the Special Advisor's report. Since our founding fathers, they, as said, inspired by the US, laid out the basic principle of European competition law and the European project as such, of course, our economy has become increasingly global. Today, companies, they need to be able to compete internationally. And the best prepared for that is, of course, those who first have proven their merits at home. And here, of course, the European single market is a perfect starting point. And this is why we have, as an example, a trade surplus in manufactured goods like cars, machines, and chemicals. And this is because European innovation and productivity has created European champions, amazing European companies whose products are in demand all over the world. And these European champions, they are not coddled favorites, freed from the need to compete in Europe. On the contrary, competition obliges companies to make better products and to develop new business ideas to attract more customers at home and abroad. And in this way, a competitive environment benefits both consumers and companies. When a company succeeds in becoming a champion in Europe, it can conquer customers all over the world. The state aid rules are also an important thing. They play a role by ensuring that no company is given an unfair advantage that may drive healthy competitors out of the market. And the rules, well, they serve to prevent a subsidy race in which those member states with the deepest pockets have an unfair advantage. In the last few years, just to give you one example, we have dealt with several cases of European governments having given state aid in the form of special tax treatment for certain companies. But an increasingly global economy also brings an increasing need for cooperation, not only in competition policy, but also in other areas like taxation or international trade. As Jean Monnet believed in the benefits of fair competition in the market, he also believed in cooperation among countries. After the First World War, he was the Deputy Secretary General of the League of Nations. And this institution embodied that international cooperation is the best guarantee for peace and prosperity. Unfortunately, this belief didn't prevail at the time, and the world embarked on a second and even more destructive war. However, the spirits of the League thankfully survived and inspired to what we now know as the United Nations. And today, when the global system based on rules is under question, I think it is important to remember the disastrous consequences that may follow when international cooperation fails. Which also means that there is a need, there's a call, there's an urgency to defend the international system of rules that the global community has built since the Second World War. Systems like the World Trade Organization that has given countries around the world the confidence to lower trade barriers and help them to become more prosperous as a result of free trade. And it is indeed in everyone's interest, because without commonly agreed rules, everyone loses out. Of course, this does not mean that the present global rules are perfect. We need to make sure that trade is not only free, but also fair. For instance, the WTO rules could be better at dealing with subsidies that hurt competition. They ban some types of harmful subsidies, but not enough. And this is why the Commission is working with trading partners like Japan and the US to tighten those rules in order to make them effective. And in relation to my work as a Commissioner for Competition, we have also started a dialogue with China on subsidies and fair competition. In parallel, we also need to reinforce the tools that we have in Europe. For instance, the Commission have made a proposal to ensure reciprocity in public procurement, so that if you can do a thing, we can do a thing, that we have a balanced, mirrored approach. And we want to establish a framework to screen foreign direct investment that affects our society. And we need to put the tools that we already have, like modern trade defense rules, to good use in order to maintain fair competition. In my own field of competition enforcement, a good example of international cooperation is the Commission's work in recent decades with other competition authorities across the world to promote a fair competition culture. The International Competition Network, it was launched less than 20 years ago by just 14 authorities, including the Commission. Today, it brings together more than 130 members of competition law enforcers from all over our global economy. And we work together, not only to coordinate our pursuit in individual cases, but also to bring our rules and the way we apply them as close together as we can. So what we thrive at is to improve competition standards, not only within the European Union, but around the world. I do hope that Jean Monnet would have been happy to see the extent to which his competition legacy is still very much present in Europe and beyond. And I think he would be proud to see the important, insightful scholars that take a chair in his name. Good luck, and thank you very much for your attention.
Nós temos agora um tempo para perguntas. Eu pedia que as perguntas fossem o mais sintéticas possível, porque o tempo é escasso. Alguma pergunta? Eu traduzo. As perguntas podem ser em português ou em inglês. Se necessário, depois traduzirei para a senhora comissária. Sim, faz favor.
Good morning. I will address my question in English to the Commissioner. Thank you, first of all, for this excellent opportunity, and to hear you, Commissioner. It's always a pleasure. My question deals with consumer redress. Consumer redress for mass damages is one of the greatest failings of the legal systems in all EU member states. The Commission recognized this shortcoming and proposed a very interesting proposal on representative actions. This proposed directive will apply to some 60 pieces of EU legislation, but not to the antitrust damages directive, as it is currently proposed. Commissioner, since there has never been a successful action to compensate consumers for antitrust infringements, would you agree that it might be good if these proposed mechanisms also applied to damages actions for antitrust infringements?
This is, probably you know much more about this than I do. Having been very instrumental in making sure that actually we have not only passed legislation about damages, but also that member states have implemented legislation. Because even though I think both Commission and Parliament and Council sometimes find it difficult to pass legislation, that's the easy part. The difficult part is to make it a reality in each and every member state so that people can go for damages. Back in the days when the proposal on damages, also when it comes to antitrust, was made, there was a call for member states also to give access to collective redress. Unfortunately, no member state took up that call for a reason that escapes me, but here we are today. And since it cannot be any different, I hope that when we gain the first experiences when it comes to damages, that we will be able later to make the push also for collective redress in antitrust. We don't, as far as I know, we don't even have the first court decisions yet. A number of court cases has been opened in relationship to the truck cartel. The truck cartel is a cartel between 6 European truck makers, the heavy-duty ones, the ones that you pass when you drive through Europe. For 14 years, they decided on the gross list price of trucks, and they also decided to coordinate when they would launch the next environmental updates of their vehicles, which means that they made it very difficult for transport companies in Europe, and there are around 600,000 of those, big and small, actually to say, well, we want to be the cheapest based on the best prices of our trucks, or we want to be the most environmentally friendly transportation company, because basically they had no choice, because they were all more or less the same when it comes to environmentally friendliness. And as a follow-up of that case, which gave those 6 companies a total fine of 4.8 billion euros, there is now a follow-up by a number of transport companies for damages. And it will be very interesting to follow these cases to see what comes from it, and hopefully also to learn from that, to see if we can have a second push. I very much appreciate the fact that we're now pushing for collective damages in other areas. I think as a follow-up to the emission scandal in Germany, I think it's a very important sort of catalyst to do exactly that. I hope we will get there, but so far I do hope that we will see that there is room for seeking individual damages, as in this example with the trucks.
Desculpa, há uma pergunta aí. Não, ainda.
Good morning. Given that we are in Portugal, I would like to address you a question on the Commission's state aid proceeding against Madeira free zone rules. So, in Madeira, Madeira is an authorized state aid regime, as we all know, and there is the tax incentives there are linked to the work post creation. Apparently, from what we know, the Commission takes the view that the work post creation has to take place in Madeira. These work post creation rules exist for 18 years. And so there is some sort of bewilderment on why now, given that the rule has been the same for 18 years, both in the state aid and the Portuguese domestic legislation. And the second puzzlement relates to the fact that in Madeira, the state aid regime authorizes shipping activities which take place in the sea. In Madeira, there are companies that operate drilling platforms in the high sea. So how do we reconcile this idea that we have to have work post creation in Madeira with the fact that the state aid regime allows for mobile and activities that take place not inland, but for instance in the sea? And finally, the fact that if we force the work post creation to take place physically in Madeira, would this not constitute a discrimination on the basis of EU law? 20 years ago, the Commission, when it analyzed the Canary Islands state aid regime, said that the Canary Islands could not restrict the hiring of employees to locals because that would discriminate these companies when hiring foreign, other EU resident employees. So I would appreciate if you could enlighten us on the Commission's rationale for this state aid proceeding now.
Well, first of all, I think it's very important that we have special access to do special things for people who live in special circumstances in our outmost regions. Because it is a very different thing to live hundreds, or in some circumstance for some of the French dom-tom, thousands of kilometers away from European mainland. This is a good thing. So when we make a special arrangement, that should of course be a special arrangement that actually serves the people living in these areas. That is basically the point of having the provisions of doing something special. In Madeira, I think we are now in the fourth program that allows for special tax regimes. And the idea of having a special tax regime is to attract business who creates jobs. And having followed the development of the different regimes that has all been Commission approved, well, then we have come to be concerned if it actually do create jobs on the islands, as it was supposed to be when these schemes were approved. Because the thing is that, of course, it creates some activity when a letterbox is put up, but it's relatively short, the activity connected with putting up a letterbox. And that is, of course, one extreme. Another extreme is, of course, I think what was intended, that jobs, real jobs, that gives people a living wage is created. And what we're looking at is, where are we in between those two extremes? And for us, the important thing is that we stay completely loyal to this very important fact that we can do special schemes for areas where people are in special circumstances in order to create the basis for a livelihood. And this is why we opened the case, because we have serious doubts whether it is actually the case that the businesses who benefit from these special tax rules also create jobs on the islands.
Thank you very much, and for the talks. It is a broader context, but it is a curiosity. You mentioned, of course, the purpose of Europe in equipment, cars, and so on and so on. But how can you explain the Europeanism in Europe when we have, this is for your last minutes, the surplus of current of the euro area is 7 times more than the surplus of China, with our social model and so on and so on. And I mean, when you see things about in favor of the Brexit, we see that the people who voted for the Brexit, because the rules of competition are very bad, because there is protection and so on. So the results are not that. I can say the names, I shall not say, of course. The best known economist from the States, Nobel Prizes, from UK, they write the books with the 300, 400, 500, and they never mention the surplus of euro area. They mention only the difference between the north and south countries of euro area. How can you explain so the in Italy, now the polls in France yesterday were not very nice as well, and so on and so on. If an historian will come to the world in 40 years' time and see the newspapers of 2018 about the pessimism and statistics about success of our current economic surplus, will be astonished. We have the biggest surplus of the world. The United States have their own currency, they cannot pay, they have the dollar. UK has their own currency, have the pound, they are very lucky for that, but they have second deficit of the world. Why? I said in Oxford, I've thought about that, but why is it explained? Sorry, it is a broader question, but I'd like to know your view about that.
I think there was something with the sound. Maybe I didn't get the entire gist of your question. If you would maybe
about
have
the pessimism of the euro area when you have the biggest surplus of the world. Why? Can you explain that? And I was saying last week, 7 times, it should be mentioned by ourselves, by professors, 7 times the surplus of China. 7 times the surplus of China. Nobody speaks about this. Why? It's a secret, it's not.
But that is also puzzling me. Okay. But it is as if we have sort of mentally decided to stay in crisis mode. Even though things are not good for everyone, things are still improving in Europe and in every member state in Europe. We still have serious issues, of course, of youth unemployment. We have to fight climate change. There are many, many things to do, but it is as if we are forgetting what we have achieved so far, all the successes that we are sitting on, so to speak. Now, talking about Jean Monnet, when they started the Coal and Steel Union, they were looking at a Europe that was completely destroyed. And yet here we are in a united Europe, 70 years later, having achieved probably the highest living standard and the most coherent welfare system ever in history for so many people. That doesn't mean that everyone is well off, but it means that many people are well off. And I think it's very important to sort of to break this paradox, because we need all this strength. We need the knowledge that has brought this success when we are going to fight our next challenges and the problems we still have ahead of us. And sometimes I worry that we have a wonderful glass of port and a wonderful meal, and we make analysis, and we worry, and we get depressed, and depression sort of gives us very small arms, and we take no action. While at the same time, those who argue for disaster and isolation and protectionism and nationalism, they're out there campaigning. And I think it is important to say, look what we achieved. It is highly likely that we can solve the problems ahead of us. And that, I think, is very, very important. Europe is the biggest economy in the world. We are the biggest and most preferred trading partners for 80 countries. For the US, it's only 20. We are the most open economy when it comes to developing countries in order to enable them to trade with us. So we have so much going for ourselves. And I think it is a very good point that we should recognize this and then use this as the energy to solve the things ahead of us.
Antes de passar à próxima pergunta, o Sr. Ministro, eu gostaria também de acrescentar alguma coisa em relação a isto.
Thank you. This is a very important topic. Why is there Europessimism? Why are there political parties making a speech against the European Union, against what Europe is delivering to citizens? And my point is that the European Union was built on the promise to deliver to European citizens peace, democracy, and prosperity. And if we look at the recent history of our own country, Portugal, it has meant exactly that. At the same time, we achieved democracy, and we decided to join what was then the European communities on the basis that we would reach peace. We were a country which had been at war. We would achieve democracy because we would join a compact of the rule of law and the rights of citizens, and we would achieve a level of prosperity which the European continent delivers to every of its citizens. And that is exactly what we have achieved. If we look 30 years later, it is undoubtable that we are at peace. We are one of the most peaceful countries in the world, in a continent which has always been at war, except for these past few years when the European Union has been in existence. We live in democracy, and we have levels of prosperity which was rarely seen in our history, if at all. And on a basis of an equal level, which was also unthinkable before. I think that the global financial crisis tested democracies and tested the global capitalism. And the aftermath of the crisis really created pain, unemployment, suffering, and the way countries and continents have managed the impact of the crisis and the exit of the crisis have created divisions. And populists and Europessimists thrive in this sort of uncertainty, anxiety, and fear. There have been people who have been the losers of globalization, and the sort of speech which was used on managing the impact of the crisis was really divisive. And this is where Eurosceptics thrive. But there's room for hope. If you see the last Eurobarometer, you will see that the Portuguese are the people who are more happy with democracy and the European Union. 72% of the Portuguese citizens are happy and proud of their democracy and are committed European citizens. And I think that is because we have shown that even living in the European Union, even being a committed country to the respect of the European Union rules, we could deliver more prosperity to the people, bring back jobs, and reduce inequality. And this is the promise of the European Union. And if there are sufficient political leaders explaining to the people that this is what the European Union brings across the continent, peace, democracy, prosperity, then we can fight Europessimism.
Good morning, Madam Commissioner. Miguel Maria Silva. I'm a professor here at the University of Lisbon Law School. Let me thank you for this beautiful moment of democracy, because it's very important for democracy to be strengthened, to have politicians being able to engage in rational debate. I think that's something that we have sorely missed, as we can see in other parts of the world, and it's in keep with European traditions, not just going back to Jean Monnet, but going back to Athens democracy. And this goes as well to the Minister César Vieira. As a former enforcer, competition enforcer, I'm not going to ask you questions on enforcement cases. I'm going to ask you a question on another aspect of, let's say, Commission's policy. You have a regulatory package, the better regulation package, that seeks to address the issue of restrictions of competition that are brought about by legislation. And this entails an analysis to be done as to the impact of legislation on a variety of levels, one of which is competition. Now, in Portugal, we didn't have a regulatory impact assessment framework, and actually we are implementing it now, and one of the core areas is precisely the competition impact assessment. Whereas I see that in the Commission, competition, the impact of legislation, and this is very far-reaching because you have lots of directives that will then condition the way legislation is implemented in national countries, and sometimes you have competitive impacts that derive not from implementing legislation at national level, but rather from EU legislation. So it's very important to keep that competition advocacy dimension as legislation is being formulated and discussed and modified by Parliament and by the Council. So my question is, what is your view as to the participation of the competition, particularly DG Comp and yourself, in exercising some monitoring of the competition impact assessment in EU legislation? My hypothesis, and I'm doing a study on this, is that there's a lot of lip service being paid in the actual reports, but competition is often confused with issues of competitiveness, and so I think there's a lot to be done there. Your comments, please. Thank you.
Well, actually, we spent quite a lot of time, myself, my cabinet, DG Comp, in working with colleagues internally when legislation is being prepared. And that comes from the fact that we have the privilege of having a quite detailed knowledge about what goes on in different markets, like the energy markets, in a number of digital markets. We've had 3 big mergers in seeds and pesticides the last year. So we have a quite detailed knowledge about what is going on. And this is why we engage with colleagues when they do a legislative proposal in order to make sure that that we get the objectives that we actually want to. Sometimes, of course, you want to frame the marketplace. If you limit the use of, or forbid the use of some pesticides, well, of course, to some degree you limit competition. because you say to those who were willing to use a very toxic pesticide, you cannot do that anymore, no matter it would give you a better chance in the marketplace. And that, of course, we respect completely, because I think that is part of sort of European policy making and European values, this idea that we as democracies will frame the marketplace. This is why we have regulation on environment, child labor, working conditions as such, endocrine disruptors, things that can give you cancer, all kinds of stuff. And we participate very actively in this so that you do not inadvertently limit competition in ways that you wouldn't do that. The thing where we still have to improve, I think, our legislative procedures is that when Parliament and Council then decides on their negotiating position, they don't necessarily do an impact assessment or a public consultation on their proposals to change the Commission proposal. And sometimes if a proposal like the proposal I made myself was based basically on a lot of work done by DG Comp and my predecessor Almunia in order to map out the competences of national competition authorities. I think we had 2 public consultations on that proposal. We talked with ministries, we talked with our national competition authorities. It took a long time, it was very thorough. And then we tabled it in front of Parliament and Council, and in their proceedings, they had no obligations to do any public consultation on their proposals to change it. And now it all went well. But of course, if you don't have to consult anyone, of course there's always a risk that you get the proposal which is your personal idea, but not necessarily something that can actually be transformed into practice. And I think everyone is very well aware of this, and at the same time, of course, completely respectful of the legitimacy of the legislators to pass the legislation that they can agree on. But this is one of the things in our processes I think we have to be aware of.
Thank you. Any other questions?
So, first of all, thank you, Mr. Vestager, for coming to the law school. It's an honor to have you. So I'm very happy and honored to have you opening the Jean Monnet chair. The title of this conference is about the globalization of competition law. But it's not really a sentence, it's a question, if there is really a globalization of competition law. Because we are seeing now that a multilateral approach to trade is being freezed nowadays. And you see all this kind of populism and protectionist measures taking place worldwide. And you talked about the proposal on regulation about public procurement so that you can do like a tick for tack with other countries. You talk about the proposal on regulation on the foreign direct investment in Europe, that it's also trying to screen the third countries' investment in the European Union. So can competition law in the future be used to protect European interests? And can we speak about a kind of a fragmentation worldwide of competition law where you see like China in merger operations, the Portuguese minister talked about that, tries to protect their industries through the approval of merger operations and in the United States and in Brazil and also in the European Union. So my question is at the end, are we watching not really a globalization of competition law, but kind of a fragmentation where protectionists arise in third countries and also maybe within the European Union and within the European Commission and the way they see the use of competition law in the future, or is still the welfare of consumers ahead in competition law? So thank you again.
Well, I think that's a very important point. For me, the thing is that we come from a very fragmented world, or a world with very little competition law enforcement. Because as said, when the International Competition Network was started, it was just 14 jurisdictions, and now more than 130 jurisdictions coming together. And not only do we work together in the International Competition Network, But for instance, us, GG Comp, myself, and the Chinese authorities, we also have a direct cooperation. For instance, we did 2 years ago a paper on how do we do merger procedures with the Chinese. And we have 2 times per year what we call a competition week, where our Chinese colleagues come here or we go there in order to exchange how do we do things? What are the procedures? And one of the things that we have pushed into this debate is the debate about harmful subsidies. And of course the Chinese, they have their priorities, but they have 130,000 publicly owned businesses. And I think for them as well, it's important that a good number of those businesses, they themselves make black numbers, that they are not in deficit, that they don't need public subsidies. Because, well, why use money if people can just, make their business run by themselves? So we try to talk and to learn and to inspire one another to change. But I think there is a second and very important push this year. And this is exactly for trade not just to be free, but also to be fair. And that I find myself to be very important. Because the risk if trade is just free is that you basically import living condition, working conditions, animal welfare, breach of human rights with the products. And this is why the new trade agreements, they have a different nature. It's my colleague Cecilia Malmström who is responsible, and her call has been to make value-based trade agreements. And this is exactly so that you can discuss issues of working conditions, animal welfare, human rights, reciprocity, trust in the trade relationship. And that I find to be a very modern way of doing things that will sort of deepen the relationship between trading partners and sort of retire the old concept of just free trade. And that I find to be very important. So I think you can say that to some degree maybe we have not taken steps back towards a more fragmented world, but we may slightly have changed the course in order to make our relationships deeper and fairer in order to build more trust between us. And it is important, some of the mergers that we are dealing with, they are notified on every continent. The beer merger was notified on every continent except for Antarctica. And I'm sure when people are in Antarctica, they drink beer as well. But they don't have a competition authority. So this was the reason why not. So it's important both sort of the very general level, when we push for a better and more coherent globalized world, but also very specifically when we deal with a merger that we can actually work very closely with our colleagues around the globe.
Any other question, a final question? Well, then I'm sure that we all concur in thanking the Commissioner and the Minister for this wonderful, enlightening session. Well, there is a question, so no final remarks yet.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Questioner. I have a question. Do you think we have arrived to a point where certain services could be considered a naturally occurring monopoly, such as Google search or possibly Amazon, or that they might arrive to this point in the future? And should we or could we do something with this, if you believe it is so?
Well, one of the good things with our Google decision is the fact that what you see intuitively, we now also have proven in the legal sense, which is that Google is dominant in Europe. In most European countries, Google search would help 95, 97, maybe 98% of search. So they have developed into sort of the road system of the internet, how to find your way. And this, of course, gives them a special responsibility that we address in the 2 Google cases so far. But it raises exactly the question that you raise. Well, what is then the nature when you have almost all of the market? And there are a number of interesting discussions on that, and one is the one you raise about, are they becoming sort of the road system of the internet, just as well as we have road systems here, or that we have an electrical grid? And for instance, when you have an electrical grid, you still want competition. You may want to buy your electricity for someone who can provide it generated with renewables, instead of buying it for someone who's generating the electricity with nuclear power and coal-fired power plants. And we can have that competition on the same grid. We don't say to the newcomers, you have to build a grid first and then start competing, because then obviously it will never happen, because you cannot have a second grid. Same thing and same consideration now. Well, if we want more competition, then how to understand this fact that now we have a grid on the internet that allows us to find our way? We have no conclusions on this yet, but this is one of the debates that is gaining more traction in these months and years. There's another important debate that comes from the fact that now we have citizens' digital rights. We own our data. We can move them from one provider to another provider. We have the right to be forgotten. But the thing is that it's very difficult to figure out what to do with these rights. How can I exercise my right of ownership to my data? And that I find to be an equally interesting debate, to say, well, when you create data by doing a Google search or another activity with one of the majors of the internet, well, could I place a copy of those data with someone else so that we create sort of innovation pools of big data for others to access? And that, I think, is also a very important debate as to how can we exercise our digital rights to allow others to innovate from the data that we create. Because it becomes increasingly difficult to be an innovative business if you have no access to big data. And that's the other side of dominance these days. It is that dominance also comes with access to enormous amounts of data that allows you maybe to be more innovative than your competitors, who will not be able to get there unless they get another access to data. And that, I think, is another debate that we will have and that will increase over the coming months and years.
So I just thank the Commissioner, the Minister, the Dean of the Law School, the Jean Monnet Chair. Thank you all, and there will be a brief intermission. The proceedings will continue, but we are just saying goodbye for the time being to the Commissioner who has to leave. Thank you. And also